My name is Tamas Fulop. I was born in Hungary in August of 1949 after Second World War, after the Holocaust. And I would like to tell you about my early childhood memories growing up in Hungary. Before I go into my early memories, I would like to give you just a little background about history of the Hungarian Jews in a nutshell, so you can kind of place the events in the right context.
Stop right there.
Hungary is located in Central Europe. It's bordered by nowadays Austria, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, Yugoslavia, Romania. In the 16th century, Turkey took over Hungary, and it was occupied by Turkey for 150 years. And it had a major conflict with the Habsburg Empire. And eventually the Habsburg Empire chased out the Turks from Hungary and occupied Hungary as an occupying force. Hungary was devastated from the Turkish occupation. They were relentlessly killing off the peasants and everybody that was not useful to them. So after a few years, the Habsburg Empire decided that they're going to move in people from Germany and Austria into Hungary. They had lots of empty territories, and the country was empty, and so they started to move in Schwabs, native Germans from Germany and Austria, and also moved in Jews from Czechoslovakia, then it was called Moravia, from that area, and the Jews were very happy to come to Hungary. It gave them a good opportunity. It was not overcrowded like the German cities and the Moravian cities, and it gave them a good opportunity to come into Hungary and pursue their religion. They got freedoms, more or less, some kind of freedoms. They were able to establish their own communities. They were able to have their own court system, which was local, and usually there was a rabbi and a dayan who maintained the Jewish community. The Jewish community was growing, and by 1850 there were probably maybe 80,000 Jews in Hungary. My grandfather, my great-great-grandfather was a rabbi in a town called Paks, which is a little tiny township next to the Danube in the middle of Hungary. And actually he was not even a rabbi, he was a dayan, but because the community could not afford or could not find a rabbi at the time that would be acceptable to them, they named my great-great-grandfather, who was a dayan, to a rabbinical post. All his children, he had 8 daughters and sons. They became either rabbis or the daughters married to rabbis, so it became a rabbinical dynasty, and were well-known names, you know, in the early 1900s in Budapest and all kinds of provincial cities. The name of the family was Adler, and my great-great-grandfather's name was Alexander Adler, and he's buried in the cemetery in Paks. And people who originated from Paks, even nowadays, you know, in 2018, come to his grave from Brooklyn and from New York and from all over the world, and they come for Kever Avot, you know, to visit one of the great rabbis of the era and the area. So I was born in 1949. My parents were Holocaust survivors. in 1944. Until 1944, Hungary was a very peaceful, wasn't that bad situation for the Jews, although they had all kinds of Jewish laws that restricted doctors to work, restricted factory or business owners to own their own factory. They had to Aryanize it and sell it out to Christian families, but it was tolerable in the context that at the same time in 1944, 2.5 million of Polish Jews were already killed. All the German Jews were deported. The French Jews, the Italian Jews from Romania were deported to Auschwitz. And the SS was running freely in Ukraine and the former Soviet Union, in Belarusia. So in that context, the Hungarian Jews in 1944 March, the month of March, were pretty well off, although they had suffered, but it wasn't too bad. Until 1944 March, Hitler decided to occupy Hungary with the tacit approval of the Hungarian governor and the Hungarian government. But that was really a black day for the Hungarian Jews. Adolf Eichmann arrived, and very quickly he rounded up, he got the cooperation of the Hungarian gendarmes and the police forces and the government, and everybody was in full participation to round up the Jews in ghettos. And by July, within 3.5-4 months, all the provincial Jews of Hungary, 600,000 people, were sent on train to Auschwitz, and most of them were killed. It is very interesting to know that the Second World War was almost over at that time. The Red Army was at the gates of Hungary. They already took over Romania. They were in Poland, and they were pushing the German army back toward Berlin. And it's the great tragedy of the Hungarian Jews that almost at the end of the war, they were deported to Auschwitz and eliminated and killed and tortured and robbed and so on, with the approval of the Hungarian government and with the approval of the local population. The Germans did not participate too much in the action. They were supervising and gave out the orders to the Hungarian government, but the Hungarian government and the population was truly the major part that this could happen in Hungary. At this point in Hungary, the Jews lived there for 250 years. There was 1 million Jewish people living in Hungary before the deportations began. In relatively well off, they were small businessmen, they were professionals, they were doctors and lawyers and accountants and small business owners, some of them very small business owners, and there were few of them that owned major factories. One of the major factories was Ganz Mavag, which employed maybe 45,000 people at the time, and the Germans took over the factory and killed some of the owners. Some of them escaped to Switzerland and so on. So anyway, just to give you a background, before I came to this world in 1949, my family was put in a ghetto in this town called Paks. There was more than 800 people in the ghetto. they were all speaking Hungarian. Hungarian was their mother language. Some of them spoke Yiddish, but not all of them. Yiddish speaking was not very popular in this part of Hungary, but they were religious Orthodox Jews, keeping kosher households, going to the synagogue every day, morning and evening, eating kosher food. There was a rabbi, there was a shochet, there was ritual slaughtering. So they had everything that they needed. My family was taken to Auschwitz. There was 120 people in the immediate family. My grandmother had 7 sisters and brothers. They all had kids. Her parents, cousins. So roughly we could say 120 people in the family. And they were all killed in Auschwitz as soon as they arrived on June 6, 1944. My grandmother and my mother was selected as they arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And according to my grandmother, and I heard this story many times, they came front of Joseph Mengele, and my grandmother remembered his name, and she always told me that he was a very good-looking man. He looked very proud in his uniform, and he was directing the people in the line from left to right. So my mother was sent to the left, and my grandmother was sent to the right, and at this point they were already separated from the men in the family, and they were separated from the children. So the only thing that my grandmother wanted to do is stay with my mother. And from her story, he stood front of Mengele, and my grandmother stood front of Mengele, and she said, "We are very strong people, and we were told we're coming here to work, and we want to work, and we'll do anything. We'll work very hard, and please let my daughter come with me. We don't want to be separated." So Mengele looked at her, and she motioned to my mother to go with that side. They truly did not understand what's going to happen next, and they didn't know what is left and right. But they soon discovered, what that means. They were in Auschwitz for several weeks, living in terrible condition, and they were told by other prisoners that, if you were separated from your family, that means they were already killed, and everybody just pointed to the chimney and saying, "That's where your family is." So they were transported to Germany, to a town called Opel, where Siemens had several factories, and they were building tracks for light and heavy tanks. And my mother and my grandmother worked in this factory until 1945 May, when the war was over and they were liberated by the American army. My mother was only 16 years old, and when she went to Auschwitz, and she was 17 when she was liberated, and they were, there was no transportation, railroads and whatever. They waited until they were able to be transported, and took them a few weeks to get back to Hungary. And everybody with them, they wanted to get back to the place where they took them from, to see if the family came home and if the family came back. So they made their way back to Paks, to this little town in the middle of Hungary, and they found out that nobody's coming back, and that is how it is. The house where we lived, where my grandmother lived before the war, was ransacked. The Germans, first the Hungarians, robbed everything out of the house, although the government put a lock and stamp on the house, but the crowds took everything away. And then the Germans kept it as a warehouse, and then when the Russian forces came to liberate Hungary, they kept horses in it. So the house was in shambles, but my grandmother was 44 years old. She was a very strong woman, and she decided to, start a new life. With all the tragedy that happened, they had no choice.